I'm Robert Dorr, the president of AI, and I'm very happy to welcome you all today to this, I think, really going to be a terrific conversation with three wonderful people. And I want to start out by mentioning the person who sort of made us do this and get it done fast and kept us inspired, and that's Sally Satel. When I first came to AI about 8 years ago, the very second scholar I met after the great John Macon was Sally Satel, and she welcomed me to this wonderful community so warmly and so kindly, but then she also showed me through her work on issues concerning mental illness and addiction and healthcare and cities how to be a great scholar. And I've been inspired by her work ever since. And I'm so happy that she told us that we had to bring our special guest Michael Shellenberger, to the AI stage to have a discussion about his latest book, Fransicko. Is that how you say it? I got it wrong. See, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. That second subtitle, I like that a lot. I'll say that again. Why Progressives Ruin Cities. As someone who comes from New York City and spent some time in the 90s and early 2000s, trying to make New York City better from what it had become in the 70s and 80s, this book has struck a particular note. And it's a great book. We had a lovely conversation upstairs about it, and you're going to hear a great conversation today with Sally, representing AEI and her work, and also Ryan Streeter, the director of our Domestic Policy Studies program. He also is a great scholar of cities and urban politics and ways in which not so much things have gone wrong, but how things can get better and how things can be improved and make our communities more conducive to human flourishing, which is what we're all after. I think that's what I wanted to say to introduce this great panel discussion. I do want to welcome Michael to the stage. He's also written another book. You might have thought, well, which is this? Because it just seems like yesterday that you wrote Apocalypse Never, which is also, in a way, a kind of challenge toward progressive orthodoxy on another big issue. So it's remarkable that you can cover both ground so well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sally and Ryan and Michael and welcome you to AI. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, wanted to start, Michael, just by having you say a full paragraph or two about the book, and then Ryan and I will ask you some probing questions, and then we have an hour, so we'll try to end at about 2:40, and then take questions from everyone else.
Wonderful.
Okay?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. It's a pleasure to be back at AEI. This is a really important organization and a place that I've come to really respect and rely on. Sally was an important source and inspiration for this book. I've come to agree with her on, well, I can't think of anything I disagree with her on. So, but certainly on this issue that a big part of the reason for the current opioid epidemic is due to the mistreatment or lack of treatment of mental illness, and that a lot of people were self-medicating when they should have been getting better medical care. I come at this as, I'm most known for my work on the environment. My book on the environment was published last year, Apocalypse Never. I had a chance to do a follow-up to it for HarperCollins, and this was the topic I really wanted to do. My late aunt suffered from schizophrenia. She was never homeless. She did very well for folks with that mental illness. I lived in a group home in Denver. I've had two friends from high school that have both died from complications relating to drug addiction and homelessness, and I have another friend that's still struggling with long-term cocaine and alcohol addiction. I live in Berkeley, California. I lived in San Francisco. This is a part of the world that I just absolutely love, and I'm a very sensitive person, and still, even though I'm certainly more moderate than I was when I was part of the radical left, still really heartbroken and sensitive to the humanitarian crisis on our streets, which is both a particular challenge on the progressive West Coast, but most of you may now know that we had 96,000 people die of drug overdoses and drug poisonings last year. We're in the midst of two absolutely horrible drug epidemics. The most famous one is the opioid crisis, which starts with the overprescription of prescription opioids, becomes a heroin epidemic, and we're in fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid, and it's incredibly deadly. Half of our overdoses came from fentanyl. But we're also in a terrible meth epidemic. There's actually looks like a really terrific book coming out early next month by Sam Quinones, who wrote Dreamland, which was a book about the opioid crisis. His new book is about the meth crisis. So I'm just excited to be here. I've also been influenced by another scholar at AEI, Scott Winship, and particularly by the work that he's done around the history of social programs in the United States, and San Francisco goes through that because part of what I'm trying to do is make an argument that we're dealing with a drug addiction and untreated mental illness crisis first and foremost, and that this is not a function of rising poverty or Reagan's cuts to the housing budget, which is one of the chestnuts that progressives like to tell. So I'll stop there, and really honored and grateful to be able to participate.
Okay, I'm going to ask the first question, then we can go. The chairs were supposed to be kind of like
They
we
don't
all
smooth
looked
it.
at each other.
That's all right, we can rearrange
maybe
things.
Ryan can move his a bit. Anyway,
move this way.
one of the things in the book, and it's really it's an excellent book. When you talked about the history of the term homelessness, could you encapsulate that for folks?
Sure. So the word homeless is an old word. I mean, it definitely goes back to the early 20th century, but it became a propaganda word in the 1980s. And by that I mean it was deliberately chosen to mislead people about the nature of the people we call homeless on the streets. And that's not my opinion. This is something that numerous scholars pointed out in the early 1990s, including Christopher Jenks of Harvard, who wrote one of the best books on homelessness. And it was clearly designed to get people to think of this as a problem about housing. So if we kind of go, these people are homeless, then the frame is we're dealing with a problem of poverty and of lack of housing, because that's just how framing and cognitive, that's how our brains work. So the word homeless is really designed to trick your brain into thinking of this as a problem of poverty. It's also designed to hijack your sympathies and distract us from what's really going on, which is untreated mental illness and drug addiction. In the 1980s, there was a crack epidemic, crack and alcohol, which were the two drugs that really paired in the 80s, leading to homelessness. And then the other jargon that would be used is this word disaffiliation. And disaffiliation, so the basic picture is you become addicted to alcohol or other substances or drugs, you stop working to service your addiction all day long, you stay with family and friends until you steal from them or borrow from them, and they kick you out and they separate themselves from you. It's a very traditional pattern, and then you end up on the street. And so I think the progressive left, really the radical left, but to some extent the broader left, has done a real disservice to folks that are in need of medical care and to a great extent some amount of intervention, legal or voluntary, but instead we've been providing them with housing, which has not served them well, has not dealt with the root cause of the problem.
Can I do a follow-up?
Yeah, go for it.
You have a lot in the book about moral foundation theory, and that's rooted in Jonathan Haidt's work. I'm sure most folks know. Can you apply that both to do a little psychoanalysis, as it were, but apply that to the advocates as well as the politicians? Sure.
So the big prey in San Francisco turned out not to be the politicians. It's not. It's really the big prey were the advocates, the intellectual architects of this discourse, of this way of thinking, and also I think the other big prey is the religious impulse behind all of this. And so Apocalypse Never argued that apocalyptic environmentalism is a religion. It has both a new morality and a vision of the supernatural. Similarly, San Francisco makes that same argument. This is, by the way, the second book in a trilogy of books I'm doing on the threats to civilization from within. And so I try to understand this religion, which is now being called woke religion. It's not an expression I used in the book, but we're describing the same thing. And the person that has done the best work on this is Jonathan Haidt at New York University, and he is a co-founder of something called moral foundations theory, which argues that all religions, all major religions, have 6 foundational values. And that what progressives have done with woke religion is that they've emphasized one of those 6 values above all the others, and that value is care, or compassion, but care is the word that he uses. And I mostly agree, but we went a little bit further, I think, to argue that this woke religion, which is also what we argue is a kind of San Fransicness, a kind of unchecked compassion, a compassion not balanced by what you might call Old Testament values, but not bound by discipline or hard work or accountability or responsibility. We go further and argue that really this victim ideology, this woke religion, does actually redefine all 5 of the other values along with care around victims. So for example, one of the 6 moral foundations is the value of sanctity. And in a traditional morality, you might say it's immoral to contaminate your body with drugs because your body is sacred and you should care for your body. Or it's wrong to allow people to camp on the sidewalk or defecate in public because you're violating the sanctity of the city, of our civilization. That would be a traditional view. So how do adherents to the new victimology view it? They would say that we should protect the sanctity of victims and of sanctity of victims' bodies. And so victims should be free to do whatever they want because victims themselves are holy, they're sacred, and so we would violate the sanctity of victims by arresting them for breaking the law, including for reasons related to their addictions. And so what I found in the book is I would find radical left folks defending people being addicts on the street, living in miserable conditions because of bodily autonomy, which is a way of saying their bodies are sacred and they should not be, we should respect the sanctity of it, and that it would be violated by the system, but it would not be violated by drugs. And I find the same thing, for example, one of the questions is, if victimology is so concerned with victims, why are progressives solely concerned with African Americans killed by police and not concerned with the 30 times more African Americans who are killed by civilians? That's an interesting question. Like, why would that be? And the answer is that only the system can be victimizing. And so that if a Honduran drug dealer stabs a drug addict with a machete, which is something that occurs frequently, as retribution for not paying, that's not as important as, or not really to be concerned with as arresting somebody, because one is by the system and the system is evil. Pace Rousseau, who said that the society and the system is what corrupts and denigrates people.
If I could kind of just follow up on the kind of what you've learned in writing the book, just about the kind of political structure that enables all of that, because that's a really compelling argument just about the ideological and quasi-religious or religious sort of structure that has taken over a lot of people's minds, and yet politically it expresses itself differently in different places. And over the last 20 years or so, I and others have written about just the kind of leftward trend in city governance overall. 20 years ago you used to have kind of in partisan terms a pretty equal split, and you've really seen in most major metro areas the core city sort of being dominated by the left side of the political machine that kind of is in that particular state. And yet some cities that are kind of very self-aware as progressive haven't had some of the same problems as like a San Francisco or a Portland, right? Yeah. Where the mindset you're describing seems to in some way be organized to really create an incentive for politicians to act on it.
Right.
Whereas in other cities, as I've mentioned before, I'm familiar with Austin, having lived there, progressive city, and yet their experience with kind of street homelessness is creating a bit of a backlash now that you don't see in San Francisco. And you know the Bay Area so well, you're from there. All eyes have been on it over the past couple of years as this problem has metastasized and gotten worse. What incentive does the political class have there, or that they don't have, that you see in some other places that might consider themselves progressive, and yet at the same time, people are demanding other actual real solutions to this problem?
Yeah, great question. So I think this is, the short version is, I think it's really about culture more than it is about particular institutions, although well, let me say it this way. So my whole family is very progressive, and my sister is very progressive. She lives in near Boston and does permanent supportive housing, including for people that are dual eligible or dual diagnosed with mental illness and drug addiction. And she objected strongly to the subtitle of the book. She liked the book. She read the book and she was like, yeah, I'm persuaded this is an addiction problem, fundamentally, not a housing or poverty problem. But progressives in Boston don't behave like progressives in San Francisco. And she's mostly right, although what's occurred now in the last few months is that an open drug scene has emerged in Boston, and I'm not familiar that much with the East Coast, but in a place that is Massachusetts and Cass, so it's known as Mass and Cass in Boston, but it's an open drug scene. And what's so interesting about it is that when you read the Boston Globe's coverage of the open drug scene, it describes it as an open drug scene. It says the opioid homeless crisis, but it describes what's occurring there as fundamentally a place where people buy and sell and use drugs, and that the tents that are there are people that are fundamentally servicing their addiction. In San Francisco, we have just used euphemisms. I mean, there is coverage of the addiction problem, but it's homeless encampments, which is makes it sound like everyone's camping out and helping each other, as opposed to places of real terrible abuse and victimization. So what is the difference? I think some of it is just cultural. One of the things when I would interview people would say, it's the Wild West out here. And I would kind of roll my eyes and go, come on, that's just silly, like Wild West. And then by the end of the book, I was like, wow, no, it is the Wild West out here. Like there is still a culture of Wild West. San Francisco was the last city to shut down the opium dens that Chinese immigrants created in the 19th century. That everyone shut them down before we did. We had more bars per capita than churches. There's definitely a corrupt political apparatus in San Francisco. So the most dramatic instance of this is that taxpayer money goes to subsidize housing for homeless people, for addicts and the untreated mentally ill. The people that run those programs get the people that are staying in those apartments to go and vote for the candidates that they want, and then those candidates turn around and maintain the funding structure. So there's clearly that, but I push back against the idea that this is reducible in any way to money, because in any situation, including in ones that I admire, like in Amsterdam, which is sort of the model, I believe is the gold standard of how you deal with addiction and mental illness, you're still doing big contracts. They do big contracts to Salvation Army. So I do think it's at bottom an ideological problem. I did go to Austin. I've been to Austin twice over the last couple of weeks. I went to Denver. I've obviously paid a lot of attention to Philadelphia, where there's a very bad open drug scene. And Austin is very interesting because I look at Austin as a model for what we should be doing because, as you know, they had a very progressive mayor and city council that came in that basically allowed public camping. There was a backlash. Voters passed a ballot initiative, I believe 60-40, to ban public camping, but it took the governor and the legislature passing legislation to ban public camping to really make a change to things. So I think that part of the reason I wanted to do San Francisco was I think that the problem for conservatives, or for what you might call the center-right, or even in San Francisco we would call moderate Democrats, has been that they just haven't had the language or the thinking or the proposals for how to deal with this problem. And so progressives here, they think what conservatives are saying is that we just want to lock up all the addicts and put them in jail. As opposed to saying no, and this is why I think Sally's work has been so inspiring, is this is obviously an untreated mental illness problem, it's an addiction problem. Our proposal is for something we call Cal Psych, as a new, and liberals love new government programs, so it's probably more appealing on the left. But when you say we need to have Cal Psych to help the mentally ill and addicts, it changes, I think, how liberals think about it. And so for me, that was one of the things I wanted to offer in San Francisco, both to moderates on the left and right, was we do need, it's not just a messaging question, we need to offer new institutions.
Yeah. And I know we're going to get into these issues of addiction and kind of what the best interventions are, what you think after having written the book they are. But before we do that, just since a lot of people here today and watching may not know the distinctions on the housing front, because this has been such a central part of the debate, and where cities have kind of differed from each other is what their sort of housing solution is. There's the housing first solution, there's permanent supportive housing and shelter and all of that. Could you just lay out sort of the kind of competing ideologies when it comes to housing? Because for a lot of people who are walking down the street seeing a lot of homeless people, their first kind of impression is that these people shouldn't be here, they should be somewhere else. And there's a whole debate raging in the background about what that something else should be.
Absolutely. Let me start by saying what I think we should do, which is what the Dutch do in Amsterdam, which is that they have sufficient shelter for everybody that needs it. They've built sufficient shelter for everybody that needs it, which means that they have empty beds at any given time. I shadowed a social worker where we found a homeless man or a man trying to sleep on the park bench, and the person I was shadowing said, you can't sleep here. We have a shelter bed for you. Let me take you there. Now, I mean, he ultimately, because it's gray area, we did let the guy sleep there that night. But then he said, I'm going to come back tomorrow, and then you really have to go into the shelter. So everybody has to be sheltered, so that's a shelter-first policy. And you're saying you need to be in shelter because it's not safe on the street. That's just the basic view of the Dutch, and that's why you don't see homeless people in Amsterdam. Then when you're in shelter, then you would be you would get some evaluation if you need medical care, including psychiatric care, so that's also treatment first. And then housing is something that would be earned. And so what a lot of people want is their own room. They want their own apartment. They want their own studio apartment. That's what everybody wants. I mean, who doesn't want a studio apartment in Amsterdam? I certainly do. But you have to earn it. And so I saw Renee, who's a character in the book, a Dutch social worker, basically arguing with people who would be like, I want my own room. And he would say, you can have your own room, but you're not taking your meds. Or you can have your own room, but you're not showing up for your job that we arranged for you, and you need to show up for your job. So the housing is earned. So shelter first, treatment first, housing earned. That's the right way to do it. What we do in California is that we have deprived funding for the shelters because out of a utopian idea that everybody deserves their own house, their own apartment. And this is actually official federal policy called a housing first policy. Malcolm Gladwell did a real disservice on this issue. In the mid-2000s, he wrote an article for The New Yorker advocating housing first. Philip Magnano, who worked for George W. Bush, advocated this. I mean, David Frum, recently I saw him was advocating for housing first. So, it became bipartisan. And it's just a really simplistic idea. The idea is that you need housing to stabilize and to overcome your addiction and mental illness. The truth is that you need shelter for that, but housing really should be earned because it is expensive. It is a reward for making progress on your personal plan.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, no, I certainly see the wisdom, the wisdom of that, and I know the incentives are all misaligned here, but obviously shelters have to be so much better than they are. I mean, I have seen 1 billion patients who would rather sleep outside than, as you know, people are. Stuff is stolen and worse. So, you ask in your subtitle why progressives, not how, why progressives ruin cities, and I have your list of 6 reasons. So I'm just going to read that to the to folks, and then you can fill in the 7th. Okay.
Okay.
So you've touched on some of them, but I think this is also an organizing summary. They block new housing construction in cities and suburbs and divert funding from homeless shelters to the permanent living situations. Defend rights of people they characterize as victims to camp on sidewalks and parks and so on. They intimidate experts and policymakers by attacking them as being motivated by hatred of the poor, people of color and the sick, and causing violence against them. And that's a really powerful, I mean, if you want insight into the mentality of the advocate class when it comes to this, I think your book is incredibly illuminating on that. And let's stipulate, I think a lot of these people do mean well. They really do want to help people. I personally think they're quite misguided, having worked with people with addiction problems for a long time. If unless you're incredibly motivated, so many people are ambivalent about quitting drugs, and if it's available and if it's normalized, they're probably not going to stop. So these situations where there's free access, and in some ways, honestly, it almost seems encouraged, not just the old, meeting people where they are, which I'm sympathetic to. You don't want to come in with a, jackboots and a coercive mindset. You want to invite people to get care and to have them trust you. But how long does this phase go on, and sometimes I think way, way too long, and I know you do as well. So I have a few more. Reduce penalties for shoplifting, and now here we have 5 Walgreens, right, being closed down. And this is about the mentally ill specifically, prefer homelessness and incarceration to involuntary hospitalization for the mentally ill. An ideology that blinds them to the harm of harm reduction, which is interesting, and that goes in, relates to what I was just saying about this, what I call subsistence harm reduction, which is to say we'll meet you where you are and effectively leave you there.
That's a great word. I never heard that
As
before.
opposed to aspirational harm reduction, which is, we want to move you along. And some people, hopefully many, do want to move along. But and then there's one left. And I shouldn't make this into a quiz, but it's leadership. And that's number 7 about how they've ruined cities. That the leadership seems paralyzed from what you were describing. So maybe you can say a little bit more of that.
Sure. Yeah, so the book is called Why Progressives Ruin Cities, but there's a bonus reason, or the 7th reason, which is because moderates and conservatives let them. That's the punchline of the book, and that's where I then describe why conservatives had failed to contest progressive hegemony in so many cities, a growing number of cities that you've documented. The short answer won't be a surprise to any of you, which is just that cities have not been the high priority for Republicans and conservatives that they need to be. That's not to say that AEI and Manhattan Institute and other center-right organizations haven't done great work. In fact, in addition to Sally, I also quote Chris Rufo, who's famous for critical race theory now, but he was actually a really terrific journalist on open drug scenes and untreated mental illness in cities, and also Stephen Ide, who's a senior scholar at Manhattan Institute. But when we attempted a recall of Governor Gavin Newsom. I'm a former Democrat, I'm now an independent, but I endorsed the former Republican mayor of San Diego, and I campaigned with him a little bit. We did a press conference in front of an open drug scene in Los Angeles, and we gave a very, intelligent, I thought, and well-informed presentation to the reporters. But after we were done, the reporters all went to him and they were just like, what are you saying? You just want to arrest all these people? You just want to arrest the homeless? Is that what you want? It's a very liberal media in California, but it's not, I don't think it's unusual. I think you'd be asked that question in a lot of cities. And he didn't, he's a good person. Obviously I endorse him, but he didn't have a good answer to that question. And so, that's where where this ends up going is, at a practical level, I'm proposing that the moderate Democrats and the center right in California and nationally propose universal psychiatric care. And that's not something that has been traditionally a high Republican priority. I think most of us that have been on the left have heard Republicans give reasons why we can't have universal health care or why we shouldn't have it. And I don't think that's going to work anymore, or I don't think it's working, at least on this issue. I think, and I'm not saying we necessarily need to commit to universal health care, though personally I do think we need that. But certainly universal psychiatric care is a fundamental precondition to solving this problem. At a more philosophical level, one of the inspirations from this book is the great late psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. He's famous because he wrote a really foundational self-help book called Man's Search for Meaning, about how he survived the Holocaust, how he survived the concentration camps by having a positive mentality. And I wanted to know why, and he's very popular on the left, very popular with progressives, and I wanted to understand why the left has accepted Viktor Frankl for their own personal behavior, but rejected it as blaming the victims in politics. And that's the accusation that the left obviously makes against conservatives. And that was where I came to this question of victimology. But one thing I discovered that Viktor Frankl, he loved America and he loved the freedoms that we have here. But he said, freedom's not enough, and that you also need responsibility. And he even proposed that he said, you've got a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast, and he proposed that we build a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. And I thought that was quite lovely pairing of these two values. Certainly, the right has talked a lot about responsibility but I think really elevating those two things, because freedom, I think we tend, as Americans, on left and right, we tend to kind of go, what are we about as a country? And we go, we're about freedom, but I'm arguing that really we need to go deeper and also be equally about responsibility.
Sure.
Do you? I'm curious to know kind of how the different issues that large cities are facing are sort of the hierarchy. You know, which ones are driving people out of them more? I mean, I think San Francisco is an interesting case because the power of that economy there sort of helped it to defy gravity even when people were leaving all other parts of California over the last 10 years. But the pandemic, by severing place of work from place of residence, really kind of showed how much people want to stay. And you've seen a lot of people leaving. And in some ways, it's been a statement on people's confidence in the government there, in the political class and all of that. But is there something that could turn the tide? You know, we haven't really talked about affordability. When people think about San Francisco, that's obviously at the top of people's minds. I mean, I think it ranks like 171st out of 174 metro areas on the Housing Affordability Index. We have a tech worker index that our housing center here puts out, which looks at, you know, not median income like the other one, but looks at sort of the average tech worker's income and how much home they can buy. Mm-hmm. And it ranks, you know, again, 97th out of 100, you know, in that. And that's kind of well known. And yet there seems to be some progress on this discussion about changing the way that we regulate housing and land and all of that to try to make more of it available. Whether or not it brings the cost down, I guess, is another thing. But do you think that there is hope for a city on one of these large issues like San Francisco, that even if they don't quite figure out the homelessness problem and the mental illness issues behind that, but they solve one of these other big things that seem to matter to people, would that kind of restore confidence, you think, in the political class there? Or do you kind of have to be making progress on all of them at once? Because I think a lot of our cities in the 90s, it seemed like you had to make a lot of progress on a lot of things at once.
Yeah, I mean, I have real questions about whether San Francisco can solve the open drug scene, untreated mental illness problem, what we call homelessness. It's just such a liberal city. It's just such a progressive city, and the machinery that has allowed for progressive sustained power and for the homeless problem to get worse. It's really strong. It's really powerful. I mean, I think it was like 80 or 90% of San Francisco voters voted against the recall of the governor. So it's very liberal. I have a lot more hope for California. Southern California has always been more conservative than Northern California. Plus, we have the Central Valley is very conservative. It's as conservative as the Midwest or the South. So I do have more confidence at the state level. I also think this is a problem that needs a statewide solution because, you know, one of the words that we used to use to describe the people that we now call homeless was transient, and it's because it's a highly transient population, often moving from city to city. So it's a very difficult population to treat in that way. So I do tend to think it'll be difficult. You know, there has been some movement to get some more housing. We just legalized splitting your lot and putting two houses on a single resident house. Although I do not think it's going to significantly reduce housing prices. I think the housing prices will remain extremely high. And I think the dirty little secret is that 65% of California voters are homeowners. And anybody that's owned a home in California for longer than a year has made a ridiculous amount of money on their homes. I mean, it's not uncommon to find people whose homes have increased in value threefold or fourfold over a 10 or 20 year period. Our house value has more than doubled in less than 10 years. And so it makes you more conservative in terms of voting for a different candidate because you wouldn't want anything to get in the way of that. The other thing that is depressing is that one of the responses I get from people when I would describe working on this book or even on Twitter is people go, yeah, that's why I don't go downtown. You're just like, well, yeah, but like those are like our fellow citizens, out there, and cities are important. So I'm discouraged about that part of it. But I will say that in terms of the basic agenda that we're proposing, which is shelter first, treatment first, housing earned, Cal Psych. It polls at 70 to 80% support. And one of the most interesting findings was when we said, should people arrested for public drug use or public defecation, be given the choice between jail or drug treatment, it had stronger support from Democrats than Republicans, which surprised me because I thought it was a liberal framing of it. But our hypothesis is, and I think it's right just from interviewing people, is that Republicans a lot of Republicans in California are just like, why would you even offer the drug treatment? Like, people should just be arrested. So I think that the public is significantly more conservative, the voting public in California, than either the folks in San Francisco, or than I think one might be led to believe from reading either the news media or social media.
Yeah.
I'm just going to make one comment, and then we can open it for folks. I really like your Cal Psych. The whole idea being it has to be state, because if you just fix one county, people move to the next. And
Right.
so, plus there's no accountability for a lot of these nonprofits that provide the services. But it seems to me what you have constantly, kind of hanging over your head is the, the horrible images of psych institutions. I mean, I always would like to see a neo-asylum movement, actually, but this time make it benign. And when we had the real asylum movement, even back in the pastoral care back in the 1800s, and these were on working farms, and it was a beautiful environment, and but there were no medications. And now, the synergy of those could be, amazing. Yep. But people remember snake pits. Yep. And people think of shelters as, what I described, patients, they're lucky if they don't get physically attacked. They're lucky if their meds aren't stolen. They're lucky, So, kind of rehabilitating the images of these institutions is a burden you have.
Yeah, I would agree. I would add, and I described the history of how badly we've dealt with people, particularly with severe mental illness, right?
Yeah,
Schizophrenia and severe bipolar. But before Dorothy Dix created the mental hospitals in the 19th century, people were being chained in basements and on farms or just killed. And so this is the most difficult group of people to deal with. We tell a story in San Francisco. It was a debate among my colleagues and I, since this book was a very collective effort. We tell a story where René, my Dutch character, he describes being asked to take care of a man with schizophrenia who's a friend of the family. And he says a couple times, he goes, sometimes you do things you're not supposed to do, and he's like, and I grabbed him a couple times by the lapels and was like, you gotta come with me and we're gonna go to the hospital, or else. And he was like, I don't know what the or else was gonna be, but he's a former football player, so he's a big guy. It would be really intimidating to be grabbed by René. And he tells a story, and the guy, he kind of basically muscles this guy into getting the treatment he needs. But now this man who has serious schizophrenia, he has his own apartment, he has a car, and he has a job. And René said, he was like, I just talked to him earlier this week, and I check in with him every week, and I said, how are you doing? And he said, I'm fine, but there's people staring at me through my window. And René was like, I told him, go shut your curtains. And he shut the curtains, he goes, okay, it's okay. And we told that story, there was some debate because we were like, that makes René look, it makes it look kind of like we're suggesting that rules should be broken or something, or that people need to be coerced. And I was like, yeah, it's true, but contrast that to the fact that we have more mentally ill people in the Los Angeles County Jail than any institution in the United States right now. And they're kept in plexiglass jail cells where bad things happen, and they're plexiglass so they can hose them down. And I think we need to grow up a little bit as a society, because what happened is, these hospitals were short-staffed during the Great Depression and World War II, and then Life magazine and others took photos that looked really bad. And many of the reformers wanted to improve the conditions in the hospitals, but instead, in the black and white way that Americans tend to be sometimes, the moralizing, the Puritan cultures, we said we have to just shut these hospitals down. And the result is that many of those people just ended up homeless on the streets or in jails and prisons. So part of what I wanted San Francisco to do was to say, hey, let's grow up a bit. This is a really difficult group of people to deal with. And sometimes some amount of coercion early on is going to result in greater humanity later on.
I'm a big fan of benign paternalism. Folks? Oh, okay.
Question a little bit, Michael. And you mentioned paternalism, and I sometimes think there's kind of an unholy alliance between anti-government conservatives who don't like bureaucracy and case management and hassle, and and there's some libertarians in there.
Right.
And now the left that doesn't like paternalism.
Yep.
But how do you respond to someone who says, well, you're just bringing back you're going to hassle these people, or you're being paternalistic? How have you dealt with that challenge?
Yeah, and they do say that, and so, and by the way, and of course it depends. I mean, we mentioned earlier, we were like, when we were trying to figure out we realized that we needed a new institution in California, and so one question is, what did you call it? And we decided to call it Cal Psych rather than say Cal Treatment, even though Cal Psych would ideally be treating people with like a 25-year-old guy with a heroin problem, with no serious mental illness. I mean, Sally would say probably, some the kind of anxiety and depression that I suffer from, like something that should be manageable without using heavy drugs. We decided to call it Cal Psych because we feel like when you explain to people that really this is about mental illness, we find that many more liberals are like, they get that. So what we find, if I were to rank from easiest to accept to hardest to accept of our agenda, I would probably go involuntary treatment of people with schizophrenia high as the easiest to accept, and arresting heroin addicts as for using heroin as much lower than that. Funding the police turns out to be very popular too. I didn't mention it, but we have 3 chapters in this book about homicide, the emperor of all crimes. And I just came out of it as a liberal and someone that's been working on criminal justice, just really pro-police. I was just like, the evidence for policing is outstanding. Like in terms of reducing all crimes, in terms of reducing homicide. I'm a big believer in the Ferguson effect. I think it's absolutely real. So, I think there's at least 30% of the progressive hardcore that will never be with us and that will have any objection. I mean, the really radical anti-psychiatry movement genuinely believed that psychiatric hospitals were worse than jails or prisons. That includes Michel Foucault and Thomas Szasz and R.D. Laing and all the basically the deniers of mental illness. So I guess the short answer is, for the truly open-minded folks, I say let's start with psychiatry, and then for the hardcore, I think we need to have an argument with them.
Can you? And then that gentleman over there.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned homicide because in Chicago, the situation is a little different than in San Francisco, and I was interested to read recently the wealthiest man there, Ken Griffin, that runs Citadel, has announced it's just a question of time before they move out of Chicago because of the crime problem. And you wonder, these cities, maybe not as wealthy or as strong as San Francisco, how long does it take for them to become just a failed city? That's where these things seem to be going. Now, question. So one of the freedoms that we still have in this country, which is important, is the ability to move out, which is, I think, part of what's behind conservative observation of the situation, and also to compare one place to another. So with respect to the Amsterdam model, which very interesting part of this talk, look, is any place in the US adopting that model? Are they doing it in Florida? I'd really look forward. Eventually, you've got to get the message will come up. Some people are doing it right, much better results, versus others doing it wrong.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, Miami is doing it better. New York is doing it better. We decided to use Amsterdam in part because we thought it was an easier pill to swallow than New York, particularly for San Franciscans who define themselves in opposition to New York. A lot of San Franciscans, including myself, we're like in San Francisco because it's not like New York. And it's not it is prejudice, but it's not just prejudice in the sense that, one of the things I love about San Francisco is that, when you meet people, I don't think I've ever had anybody in the Bay Area ask me where I went to school. Whereas like when I lived in Washington, D.C. and I go to parties, people will be like, oh, nice to meet you. Where'd you go to college? And it's always like, wow, is that how I'm going to be ranked on the totem pole?
Yeah.
And, and I think for those of us out in California, we like that that's not the thing, that there's a much greater value on entrepreneurialism, on innovation. We're snobs in our own way. And so we chose Amsterdam in part because it was foreign enough and it's viewed as liberal by people in the San Francisco Bay Area. But the short answer is everybody does a better job than the progressive cities of the West Coast, and certainly better than San Francisco. Miami has done a pretty good job, and we describe what it's done there, which is much more similar to a shelter-first, treatment-first policy. New York, sheltered before the pandemic something like 99% of its homeless. We shelter about a third in California. One of the most disturbing findings of our research is that it was homeless advocates in California who have deprived the funding to build sufficient shelter for all the homeless. They've also fought against a requirement to sleep in the shelters. But that's just insane. And one of the things I'm most proud of in this book, because I was able to talk to basically everybody I wanted to talk to, including the radical left and the very progressive left. I did find that even some of the most radical left advocates for the homeless, not all of them, but would say we do need to actually build sufficient shelters now and get people into the shelters because it's gotten so out of control. So yeah, but when you look at what works, it's always the same things. There isn't really any variation. There's some differences, for example, between Lisbon's approach to this and Amsterdam. Lisbon engages families more in doing interventions with addicts. But in every of one of these 5 major cities, but also in New York and Miami, they make sure they have sufficient shelter for people, that they can require them to be in shelter. They enforce laws, including against public drug use, public camping, public defecation, and they make drug treatment an alternative to incarceration rather than completely optional, which is what we've done in California.
If I could I just say one thing really quickly on the crime question? Is we just put out, we have a survey center here that does large national surveys, and just yesterday released a report where we asked people a question. Others like Pew and others have asked, where would you live if you didn't live where you are? Where would you prefer to go? And residents of big cities, the majority of them want to leave big cities, and they always kind of have. We have this idea that a lot of people want to live in big cities. Most people who live there would like to live in a smaller city or in a suburb or a small town. But the numbers now are the same as they were 1 month after 9/11 when Pew asked this question. It's like 8% of people in big cities actually say that would be their top choice of where to live, which is down a considerable amount from just a few years ago. So there is something going on right now too. Not just in San Francisco, but elsewhere that people feel like there's a crisis. And remember what it was like 9/11 to be in a big city. After that, you feel like you had a target on your back. And when we ask people what's the number one issue that you're concerned about in your local community, it's overwhelmingly crime, as you would expect. But the second issue in the cities is poverty and homelessness. And crime even in suburbs is a concern right now. So it's kind of gotten in the water. But that seems to be, just those 2 issues are huge drivers for why people aren't so enamored with large city life right now. And I say that as a longtime big city, resident who loves living in big cities.
Gentlemen.
Firstly, thanks so much. This has been a really, really great and fascinating talk. I had a question back on the subject of commitment and institutionalization, and I would also love to hear Sally's opinion as a clinical psychiatrist on this. Is that I know in the history of American mental health treatment, there was a bit of an effect with the introduction of the first generation of antipsychotic meds to use that as an alternative to institutionalization, but I think that had a lot of negative effects on the long-term care for these very severe mental illnesses. So and also there were sort of legal or regulatory changes in commitment guidelines. It's a lot harder for someone to be involuntarily committed today than it was. So I am curious about how do you overcome these sorts of both legal and practical issues of physicians, psychiatrists who'd rather prescribe antipsychotics and who don't want to go through the hassle of committing, or if they face administrative obstacles to doing that, and also how do you achieve the right balance of let's say long-term institutional care and pharmaceutical treatment.
Do you want to go first, Sally?
I actually, what I thought you were going to ask is about the general resistance to commitment. Every state has different thresholds, although they all agree, of course, there's a commonality, of course, with imminent harm to self or others, and most have a grave disability statute, although not all, which all that means is if you're just, hallucinating in the park and freezing, we can come But I guess I would say that if the rest of your vision was filled in other words, there was a good basic mental health infrastructure, then so many people would be, contained within that by the time we needed to use coercive measures, you'd be dealing with the most floridly severe individuals that it really wouldn't be. It really wouldn't be that much of a question that we have to intervene, and then once someone is stable, you can use other kinds of, especially if they've committed a crime. There's something called assisted outpatient treatment, which I know is in your book, which is to say that you want to institutionalize people, obviously in the least restrictive setting as much as possible. That's been taken way out of proportion, meaning we should never contain folks. But even so, even if we agree that containment is needed for a period of stabilization, then there's that intermediate phase where maybe someone's not, they can live in the community, but they're still not taking their meds as responsibly and regularly as they can. And then that's outpatient. Are you familiar with that? Anyway, it's where, there is a civil, no wait, is that criminal or civil? That's civil, right? Yeah. But I think there's a criminal counterpart to it. But in any case, basically where there's that continuing supervision. So that was my answer.
Yeah, I agree. And part of the vision of CalPsych is that these treatments need to be better standardized and follow better practices because there is so much inconsistency. We are not using conservatorship, which is that's what we call guardianship in California, nearly as much as we ought to be doing out of just a kind of irrational libertarianism, fear of one flew over the cuckoo's nest and snake pit. And then also assisted outpatient treatment, which came out of Laura's law in New York, where Laura, I can't remember her last name, but she was pushed in front of a subway car, I believe, by a mentally ill person that was not taking his meds. We have Kendra's law, which was a very similar situation in California. We should be using it a lot more. It's just been opposed by policymakers that have been engaged in, I think, unconscionable fear-mongering, really driven by a belief that mental illness doesn't exist. So I just think there's some really bad ideas that underlie a lot of this. I will say, it's funny because on the one hand, there's been this whole pop culture reaction against conservatorship for Britney Spears that you might have been seeing. And everyone's like, free Britney and whatever. And I'm always like, we don't know what was going on in that situation. Like the picture that people have is that her father was just, manipulating her for money, but we have no idea what kind of behavior she was engaged in or what would happen to her. But I think for homeless folks, there's much more willingness to use conservatorship or assisted outpatient treatment. One of the docs, the medical doctors that is a character in the book who works on Skid Row, she's been getting really good results with these injectable antipsychotics, which last for 30 days and stabilize people on the streets even before get them into care. But just to reinforce what Sally was saying, we think there's a lot of people that you could get into right care and treatment if you had a proper statewide system before you needed to actually start arresting anybody. But it is important, break up the open drug scenes, prevent people from using drugs in public, so that it does become easier than to get the hardcore schizophrenics, the people that wrap a lot of clothes around themselves, push the big shopping carts, and are in the greatest distress in often situations.
Well, thank you. It was a great book and
Thank you.
Really great conversation. And everybody, line up. And if you don't, if there aren't, somehow maybe some folks took it already, because I thought that...
There's a box.
There's more,
there's a
okay.
box. Yeah,
okay,
there's
great.
more. Yeah.
Well, hopefully there's enough, and if there isn't, I know that we arranged to send one to you, so you'll get one.
Awesome.
Might not be signed, but...
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks, Sally.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you so
This was
much.
great. Thanks.
Sally.